This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, standing in for Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, that's AASA. AASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. You can join for just $60 Australian if you're a waged academic, or for just $15 Australian if you're a student, unwaged or precariously waged. You can follow AASA on Twitter at AASA_animals, and you can find them on Facebook. Or take a look at their website for all sorts of up-to-date news of interest to the animal studies community. This episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. And this is a series of academic books focused on animal studies. And I'm very pleased to say that Siobhan plans to talk to some of the authors of recent books in the series for future episodes of Knowing Animals. So if you keep tuning in, you'll be able to hear a lot more about some of the most recent titles released as part of Animal Publics. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr Kyle Johannsen. Kyle is an adjunct assistant professor in philosophy at Queen's University in Canada. His academic background is in political philosophy, but he'll be known to many members of the animal studies community for his work on the ethics of intervention to alleviate wild animal suffering. Today, we're going to be talking about his 2020 book, Wild Animal Ethics, The Moral and Political Problem of Wild Animal Suffering, which was published by Routledge. Now, this is a very interesting book because, and I hope this claim won't create any controversy, it is, as far as I can tell, the first published monograph in academic philosophy focused on the problem of wild animal suffering. Welcome to the podcast, Kyle.
Thanks for having me, Josh. I appreciate it.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on this topic of wild animal suffering?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think what initially got me thinking about wild animal suffering, and also just maybe just animal ethics more broadly, is a grad course that I took when I was doing my PhD in philosophy at Queen's University. When I was in my first year of the PhD program there, I took a grad class taught by Will Kimlicka. And at the time, he and his partner, Sue Donaldson, were in the process of publishing the book Zoopolis. And this course that I took with him was basically structured around Zoopolis. So all the different units in the course corresponded to chapters in the manuscript for Zoopolis. And so we read the manuscript chapters, and we also read the articles that Will and Sue had been reading while they did research for Zoopolis. And Zoopolis talks about lots of different topics, but one of the topics is our moral obligations to wild animals, and also how we should think about wild animals using political concepts from political theory. And anyway, so this unit on wild animals is what got me thinking about our obligations to wild animals in the first place. And even though I end up disagreeing with Will and Sue about different things, it was that class that really got me thinking about our obligations to wild animals, and also particularly the obligations we owe them in light of the harms that they suffer in nature. I think if I were to flag one other thing that sort of got me interested in wild animal suffering, it's just the sheer scale of the problem. I think kind of attracted me to wanting to maybe want to work on it. When I started thinking hard about wild animal suffering and reading more of the literature on it, it became apparent that the scale of it is absolutely massive, much bigger than anything most of us normally think about. So if you think about large scale problems where that affect a large number of individuals and affect their lives quite badly, so problems that maybe involve a lot of suffering for large numbers of individuals, probably things that come to mind are things like global poverty or factory farming. But if you think hard about the details concerning wild animal reproduction and the kinds of harms they face in the wild, it turns out that wild animal suffering is almost certainly much, much larger in scale than either of those problems. And this follows just from the fact that so many wild animals produce very, very large numbers of offspring and don't really care for those offspring, don't devote much energy to each individual offspring. And so as a result, huge numbers of sentient individuals are brought into the world, and they just live these really, really short, painful lives as a product of something called the R strategy, this strategy of protecting your genes by producing huge numbers of offspring. It seems to be the case that because of the R strategy, I think the majority of sentient individuals born into the world live really, really nasty lives, so lives that may not even be worth living at all. But this means, I think, that wild animal suffering is a larger scale problem than any of the problems we conventionally think about. And so that combined with the fact that almost no one seemed to be working on it, very few people were working on wild animal suffering, these two things, its scale and its neglectedness, I think attracted me to the problem.
I want to ask what might be kind of quite a straightforward question in some ways, but in other ways is absolutely crucial. So, when we think about wild animals, we might think about environmental destruction, we might think about species conservation, but that's very much not what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
Could I ask you to explain what you mean by wild animal suffering and why it is that you think we should be concerned about it?
What I have in mind when talking about wild animal suffering, I mean, to some extent, I guess it's kind of easy to imagine negative experiences that wild animals have. Negative enough that you would say that they're experiencing suffering. Suffering could be caused by lots of different things. But I mean, I'm not just talking about negative experiences, I guess. People who are working on wild animal suffering, what they have in mind is low net welfare, I think. So the thought, if we wanted to substitute the term wild animal suffering for wild animal low net welfare, that might be a little bit more accurate, but also more onerous to say. So the thought that's, I think, really concerning for most of the people working on this issue is that it seems like most sentient individuals born into the world are living poor lives. The balance of good experiences to negative experiences is not a good balance. It seems like either the positive experiences only sort of barely exceed the negative experiences, or maybe the negative experiences actually exceed the positive experiences. There's more pain and suffering in the lives of most sentient individuals than there is pleasure or other positive experiences. And a sort of conventional view about what it means for a life to be worth living or not worth living is that a life is worth living when the positive experiences in a person's life exceed the negative experiences greater in quantity. And a life is not worth living when the negative experiences exceed the positive experiences. So this is really what I think most people working on this issue have in mind. So I mean that's what I'm talking about in the book. That's the problem I'm talking about in the book. And I think the way to address it is through humanitarian intervention. I think if animals' interests matter, if they matter for their own sake, if their interests are morally significant, then we owe duties of beneficence to them. And it seems to follow, given just what a terrible situation wild animals are in, that we owe them a collective duty of humanitarian assistance that's more or less analogous to the humanitarian assistance we think we owe to human beings who are suffering a lot, unable to meet their basic needs on a regular basis. And I talk in the book, I talk about different ways we could discharge this duty of humanitarian assistance, but I tend to focus specifically on the prospects of using gene editing to try and help wild animals.
Could you tell us a bit more about gene editing and how that could help wild animals?
Yeah, sure. So gene editing's been, it's been around for, I guess, a while now. But the particular type of gene editing that people in this literature are focusing on, and which is recent, is CRISPR. CRISPR stands for clustered, regularly interspaced palindromic repeats. Don't worry about the acronym. The acronym technically refers to a structural feature in, I think, the genetic structure of certain bacteria. But the term is now it's not just used to refer to that. It's used to refer to a particular kind of gene editing. CRISPR is an interesting kind of gene editing, in part because it's super cheap to use, way cheaper to use than other forms of gene editing. Cheap enough that amateurs have started using it, amateurs called biohackers. So if you wanted to, you could buy a CRISPR kit online and start creating like genetically engineered yeast that have different colors and things like that. Non-professionals, people who have very little resources at their disposal, can use CRISPR if they want to. That's kind of how cheap it is. Although to do anything really impressive with CRISPR, presumably you'd need more resources. CRISPR is also, so gene editing in general is more accurate than other forms of genetic modification, earlier kinds of genetic modification. But I think the most interesting thing about CRISPR gene editing is that you can use it to do something called a gene drive. CRISPR is such that not only can you use it to modify an animal who perhaps has been experimented upon, but you can make it so that the trait that you give an animal will be passed on to almost all of that animal's offspring. So you could create like a laboratory population of, say, 50 animals or something, release them into the wild, And then those animals would mate with members of the wild population. And over time, the trait that you've given those animals will just spread through the wild population, because this trait is much more inheritable than traits normally are. Normally, when an animal has a trait or a human being has a trait, they don't give it to all of their offspring. They give it to some fraction of their offspring. But with gene editing, with CRISPR gene editing, you can make it so that an edited animal's offspring will all acquire the trait, or almost all acquire the trait. And so this makes gene editing really, really powerful. You could give animals beneficent genes. You could give them a gene that confers resistance to a parasite or confers immunity to a disease, or a gene that maybe would deprive them of the ability to suffer for the first bit of their life, the first few weeks of their life. It's a little unclear exactly how much we could do with CRISPR, but the potential for using it seems to be quite great. We could try to develop a bunch of beneficent traits and spread them through wild animal populations using CRISPR.
Is there a risk that gene drives and CRISPR, given that they're quite new technologies, could lead to more animal suffering in nature?
Right.
And you're talking about making genetic modifications on quite a large scale, right? If you want to impact all wild animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So I think that there are risks associated with using gene drives. Some of those risks are for the animals being experimented upon, which is an issue that's separate from the one that you mentioned. Leaving that kind of problem aside, it's possible that a gene drive could be developed, released into the wild, and then there's a bunch of ripple effects that go throughout the ecosystems that have been affected by the drive. And those ripple effects are maybe hard to predict, affect animals' lives in different ways, and maybe more suffering than good ends up eventuating or ends up being caused as a result. This is a potential problem. So I guess there's a few things worth noting in light of that. I think one thing worth noting is that if you think hard about the R strategy and what it implies for the kinds of lives most wild animals are living, they're already in a really, really bad situation. So if you assume that they were in like a modestly good situation, the likelihood of making their lives even worse would be higher than if they're already in a terrible situation. Actually, so some people working on this literature think that our strategists' lives are so bad that they're better off not coming into existence at all. And if their lives are that bad, then it's possible that even if a gene drive had unexpected ecological consequences and caused various harms, the net result could be positive. I think it depends on really how bad our strategists' lives are, and on whether a gene drive's unexpected effects affected the size of our strategist populations. So if you suppose that a gene drive mucks up an ecosystem really badly and a lot of our strategist populations go down, their populations get decimated. I don't think we should do that intentionally, because I think there's deontic constraints on what we can permissibly do when intervening in nature. But I do think that if we did that unintentionally and we were very, very cautious, such that we didn't have any good reason to think that would happen, and we had good reason to think it was unlikely to happen, if it did end up happening anyways, I think it's morally significant that we don't really know what we're risking. We don't know whether what we're risking would end up having a net positive effect on the lives of wild animals or a net negative effect. And so I think that should affect our evaluations here. I think it's also worth distinguishing between like intentional harms and harms that were unintentional and maybe unforeseeable as well. Unintentional, unforeseeable harms are more excusable than intentional harms are from a deontological perspective. I think the last thing I'll note is that some potential interventions are riskier than others. So one kind of intervention I talk about in the book is potentially trying to transform predators into herbivores, or trying to transform R strategists into K strategists. I think if we could do that sort of thing safely, it would be a really great thing to do. But I also think after doing a lot of research and thinking about it a lot, we might discover that we can't do this safely. And then if we can't, then I don't think we should. Or we might discover that we can only do it safely in some ecosystems. So I'm kind of, even though I kind of endorse the claim that we should be researching really dramatic interventions like that, I don't endorse the claim that we should just go out and do it. I think we would need to figure out whether we can do it safely first. But okay, so some interventions, given our current state of knowledge, there's some interventions that I think we can say are maybe probably safe and also pretty large scale. And the one that I'm really optimistic about is developing a gene drive that would deprive our strategists of the capacity to suffer for the first few weeks of their life. In the book, I distinguish between mere pain and suffering. And this distinction is based on a distinction between the affective dimension of pain and the sensory dimension of pain. Cognitive scientists often distinguish between our sensory experience of pain and the extent to which we care about the pain that we're feeling. The affective dimension is the extent to which we care about our pain. And the thought is that suffering is an experience you have when you're sensing pain, you have the sensory experience of pain, but it also bothers you a lot. You care a lot about it. And some experiments have been done with animals where animals' brains are affected in such a way. It was done with mice in particular, so that they could still feel mere pain, but they're incapable of suffering. So they still have like various avoidance behaviors associated with pain, but the pain doesn't bother them nearly as much as it would if they were capable of suffering. I think it's very promising to try and take this and apply it to wild animal suffering, and particularly if we could limit the duration or the extent of the time for which our strategists are unable to suffer. If we can make it the case that they're just deprived of the ability to suffer for the first few weeks of their life. And if we could do this, it doesn't seem to me that the ecological consequences would be really all that dramatic. We'd still need to field test it, but certainly the ecological consequences would be less dramatic than turning carnivores into herbivores or our strategists into cage strategists. And I think an intervention like this, depriving our strategists of the capacity to suffer for the first few weeks of their life, would do a huge amount of good. It would do an astronomical amount of good. And given that it seems like it might be feasible to do safely and also would do a huge amount of good, I think it's definitely worth exploring, doing some research on.
Thanks. You've preempted a lot of the questions I was going to ask there. So you're not scared to admit the scary sounding parts of what you're talking about. Let me pick up on one thing straight away. You talked a bit about animal testing there. Is this something that is going to be required in order to seriously enact these kinds of interventions in nature?
Yeah, so I think so. So with respect to the proposal that we should develop gene drives that would temporarily deprive animals of the ability to suffer, that'll involve some testing. But since it's already the case that we've developed that intervention to some extent, there's already been successful cases where mice were deprived of the ability to suffer using gene editing. Because this has already been done, I think less experimentation would be necessary to develop a gene drive that would do the same thing for wild animals. But definitely, if we were to try and develop gene drives that would transform carnivores into herbivores or our strategists into cage strategists, that's going to involve a lot of experimentation. And it's worth noting that experimenting on animals is a moral cost. So when you experiment on animals, first of all, you're restricting their liberty because they're perhaps confined to a laboratory or what have you. And second of all, you're risking their health because if the experiment goes badly, if there's unexpected genetic effects, the animals could end up going through a lot of pain. The animal might lose some of its biological functioning or cognitive functioning. There's lots of bad things that could happen when gene editing goes wrong. So these moral costs need to be taken into consideration. I don't think they should be taken lightly. Conventionally, when discussing that issue with people, the moral costs of genetic experimentation, I've normally just said that, well, look, most people are not strict deontologists. Most people don't think that negative duties to refrain from harming, always trump positive duties. So, and in particular, in this case, always trump beneficence. Only strict deontologists think that negative duties always trump beneficence. Moderate deontologists like myself are willing to admit that when the stakes are high enough, when a certain threshold is met, beneficence can trump negative duties. So if, for example, if killing one person is necessary to save like 10 million people, and I think anyone who is not a strict deontologist would say, okay, yeah, it's justified in that case because the stakes are so high. But I also recognize that in order for that sort of thought to work with gene editing, it needs to be the case that we have good reason to believe that these experiments will yield interventions that might actually be implemented at some point. Because we don't want to just be experimenting without knowing whether those experiments, the potential benefits of those experiments will ever be realized. If we're doing that, then probably the moral costs of experimentation aren't justified. And so I think that initially, when just starting out, it would be best to experiment on non-sentient beings. So start with experiments on maybe insects. Insects might be sentient, but it's much less likely that they're sentient than vertebrates. So you might start by doing different sorts of gene drive experiments on insects, which is something that's already being done for different reasons. And also, so given that it's already the case that scientists have successfully deprived some animals of suffering, it might be the case that one could develop suffering deprived. And I don't know whether this would be justified, but I think there's some work being done right now at MIT, at the MIT Media Lab, on developing lab mice who are incapable of suffering, and also particularly developing lab mice who, through the use of a trigger, you could affect whether they're able to suffer at any point. So the thought would be to create lab mice who you could, using a trigger, you would be able to make them incapable of suffering for a period of time. And the idea is that you would do this when they're being experimented upon or what have you to make it so that they don't experience discomfort during the experiments. I don't know whether it's okay to do that because I suspect that it might undermine efforts to extricate animals from exploitive relationships. It might sort of end up legitimizing those exploitive relationships. But in the event that such animals do become available, I think that using them in gene editing experiments would decrease the moral costs. It's better to do gene editing experiments on laboratory animals who can't suffer than it is to do gene editing experiments on laboratory animals who can suffer. There's different ways that we could try and incorporate a capacity building phase where experiments are done on animals who either might not be sentient or who can't suffer. And once this capacity building phase is over, then you can move on and continue with research.
What's the end goal here? So let me paint a picture that maybe you like the sound of, or maybe just sounds bizarre. In the future, would you like to see lions eating grass, or would there not be any lions left, or what happens to predators?
Okay, sure. So yeah, assuming that these gene drives have been successfully developed and implemented in a safe manner. So we're looking way ahead into the future, I guess. The idea is not to eliminate predator species, right? It would be to convert them into herbivores. So I don't know what an herbivore lion would be like. But yeah, I think the idea would be something that used to be a lion. Maybe I don't know whether we'd call this being a lion anymore, but it would be something that had an evolutionary kind of sort of connection to lions. And yeah, it's eating grass and whatnot now. I think that an ecosystem like this would probably have far fewer animals in it than ecosystems with large trophic chains. So there probably wouldn't be nearly as many animals at the very end. But I mean, so it's worth noting that there are ecosystems on Earth that have very, very short trophic chains where there aren't predators or there are only very few predators. And you usually find these ecosystems on islands. I think it's worth noting that. So it might seem like the ecosystems that one might envision where there's only herbivores or only case strategists, they might seem like they just couldn't work. But I think the fact that we can find ecosystems that are already sort of close to that on Earth right now suggests that ecosystems like that could work, that they're not just completely crazy.
So I know that a lot of animal activists listen to Knowing Animals. Do you think that activists should redirect their efforts towards wild animal suffering? Or perhaps to put the question another way, how do you think we should prioritize wild animal suffering compared to, say, promoting veganism?
I discussed this in the book a bit in the last chapter. And I think I give maybe a slightly evasive answer because I don't say yes or no to one or the other. I don't say, let's prioritize wild animal suffering. And I also don't say, let's prioritize traditional animal rights activist goals like eliminating factory farming and promoting veganism. So there's really good reasons on both sides. I think that considerations of beneficence more strongly support devoting one's efforts to wild animal suffering or to addressing that cause area. But I also think that there are other considerations that are relevant to cause area selection that aren't just about beneficence. And in particular, I think traditional animal rights cause areas are connected to our negative duties in an important way. I'm vegan myself, and I think probably a lot of your listeners are vegan. And if you just sort of reflect on your experiences as a vegan, when you go vegan, you dramatically reduce your contribution to animal exploitation, but you don't completely eliminate it. It's actually really, it's almost impossible to completely eliminate one's contribution to animal exploitation. And the reason is because, so even if you're not consuming or buying animal products, there's an excellent chance you're buying products that are sold at outlets that still sell animal products. So you might be buying at grocery stores that sell animal products or eating at restaurants that also sell animal products. Even if you could avoid doing that kind of thing, you're still paying taxes, and you don't have no individual has control over what's done with their tax dollars, or not much control. Governments control that. And governments in just about any Western society are subsidizing things like like dairy industries. They're subsidizing animal agriculture. So your tax dollars go towards this sort of thing. Completely extricating yourself from animal exploitation is not something you can do by yourself. It requires collective action. And I think that that's an excellent reason to care a lot about causes that are connected to the elimination of exploitation. And it's a reason that's not about beneficence. It's about non-maleficence. It's about trying to avoid contributing to harms, trying to avoid doing things that are causally connected to harms. It's a very sort of deontological reason for caring about a cause area. So I end up sort of saying, we've got good reasons on both sides. There are excellent reasons of beneficence to care about wild animal suffering, and there are some other reasons that are about non-maleficence that we have to care a lot about traditional issues. That seems like a sort of stalemate, but I think it's worth noting that there's like traditional issues are not entirely separate from wild animal suffering. So I think that one really good way to get people to care about wild animal suffering would be to eliminate animal exploitation. So I think if we were all to recognize animals as members of the moral community, we were all to recognize that their interests matter as much as ours, and we were all to act on that thought. We were all to stop contributing to animal exploitation. We all go vegan. I think doing that would make us all much more likely to care about wild animal suffering. I think that people who have been socialized to think that animals matter less and who just sort of don't think too much about animals in general are unlikely to be very sympathetic, or less likely to be sympathetic to wild animal suffering, to the animals in the wild who are suffering. And sort of going through this process of going vegan and recognizing animals as members of the moral community makes one the kind of person who is much more likely to really care about wild animal suffering. And so that itself is a reason for people who care about wild animal suffering to want everyone to go vegan, to want there to be advocacy that's addressing traditional animal rights issues. I think that there's a kind of transitional process that we need to go through to really thoroughly and on a large scale at some point address wild animal suffering. And part of that process will involve the elimination of animal exploitation.
I see. So if someone is kind of convinced by your arguments, perhaps the thing they should be doing right now is fairly traditional vegan advocacy. Or do you feel that there might be more specifically targeted advocacy related to wild animal suffering that we could be doing now?
I think there is room right now for people who want to work on wild animal suffering. I think it's good for some people to be working on wild animal suffering right now. I think that's largely because it's super neglected. Very, very few people are working on wild animal suffering right now. And so if we can get more people working on it, we'll probably just think of more things. We'll think of more ways that wild animal suffering could be addressed, things that no one's thought about yet. And that's not going to happen unless we have people working on it. So more people working on wild animal suffering would be a good thing right now. But I don't think that it would be I don't think it's a good idea for people who are primarily advocates working with advocacy organizations to be advocating for something that a philosopher might talk about in their work. So I think it's great when you're writing a philosophy book or philosophy papers to be talking about lots of different things, including some fairly radical conclusions like the ones I talk about in my book. So talking about transforming carnivores into herbivores or transforming R strategists into K strategists. In philosophy, I think there's a place for that kind of discussion. But if you're an advocate working for an advocacy organization, I don't think you should be pushing conclusions like that because it'll just alienate your audience. A lot of people will find that the idea that we should turn, say, carnivores into herbivores just so counterintuitive that they'll stop listening to whoever's talking to them, and there'll be a lost opportunity to do some good if you try and push that conclusion on them. So people who are working on wild animal suffering right now as members of advocacy groups, and there are some people doing that, by the way. So Wild Animal Initiative is one of these groups. A group called Animal Ethics is another. And to a lesser extent, a group named Rethinking Priorities or Rethink Priorities is also interested in wild animal suffering. They aren't arguing or trying to convince people that we should be transforming carnivores into herbivores or R strategists into K strategists. They're focusing on more sort of smaller and medium scale interventions for the most part. And I think that that's wise of them. I think it's much easier to get people on board with the idea that, for example, we should try and eliminate certain species of non-sentient parasite or try and vaccinate wild animal populations against diseases. It's much easier to convince people that this is a good thing to do than it is to convince them that we should be transforming carnivores into herbivores. I think one thing that can be part of this transitional process is what these groups are doing right now. So raising awareness about wild animal suffering and getting a lot of people on board with smaller or medium scale interventions is part of the process that's needed for people eventually to get on board with larger scale interventions.
Now, Kyle, every guest on Knowing Animals is asked 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So I can't, but I'm just going to guess maybe that this was the first. So I think it might have been Peter Singer's All Animals Are Equal. That particular piece appeared as a chapter in the book Animal Liberation, but it also appears as part of an edited collection.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
So the first thing I ever wrote was the term paper for that grad class I mentioned, the one that I took with Will Kimlicka when I was doing my PhD in philosophy. The first one I ever published would have been a commentary on an article written by Yu Kwang Ng. Ng's article and my commentary were both published in a journal called Animal Sentience.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think I would name 2. So I mentioned that I was influenced quite a lot by a grad class that I took with Will Kimlicka. And the kind of centerpiece of that class was the manuscript for the book Zoopolis. I think that I would say Donaldson and Kimlicka have had a bigger influence on me than any other animal studies scholars have.
What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I don't have a good answer to that question. I think there's lots of great things that animal studies scholars are doing right now. Maybe the only thing I'd say in response to that question is lots of people are not working on wild animal suffering right now. Wild animal suffering is neglected in general, and in the context of animal studies, it's still relatively neglected. I think that if you're someone who's not working on it, at the very least, what you should do is refrain from completely ignoring it when in contexts where it's not appropriate to completely ignore it, and also refrain from denying that it's a problem. So it's not, I think traditionally, animal studies scholars have tried to just circumvent this. They just try not to talk about it at all, not to mention it. Insofar as if it ever gets brought up, they might get defensive and try and argue that a moral commitment to animals doesn't yield any kind of commitment to intervening in nature. I don't know. When you encounter it, don't brush it aside. Acknowledge that it's a problem at least.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I was going to say that maybe this would surprise people, but I think given the discussion we've had so far, it won't be surprising. I think the main thing I would want is, and maybe this is a lack of imagination on my part too, but I think I would want people to go vegan for the right reasons. Everyone to go vegan for the right reasons. That's in part because if everyone went vegan for the right reasons, and by the right reasons, I mean there's a few right reasons, but a major one is just animals. Animals are morally significant. Individual animals are morally significant, and we shouldn't be exploiting them. If people go vegan for that reason, first of all, animal exploitation will largely end. Animal agriculture will collapse if everyone goes vegan because there will be no market for animal agriculture's products. So that would be great. But also, if everyone goes vegan for the right reasons, they're primed to care a lot more about wild animal suffering than people currently do. Going vegan for the right reasons would be great because the effects it would have on animal exploitation, ending animal agriculture and whatnot. But also because it would be a huge step towards building up support for addressing wild animal suffering and for developing interest in creating effective interventions.
What are you working on next?
So one of the things I'm working on is, and you're involved in this, I'm guest editing a topical collection for the Journal of Agricultural and Environmental Ethics. This topical collection is about positive duties to wild animals, and it'll include papers from a variety of perspectives, some of which are more conservative and some of which are more pro-interventionist. But the topic is positive duties to wild animals, and wild animal suffering will be a main, I think, issue throughout the collection. The other thing worth noting is, and I don't know how serious this project is yet because I haven't even written the proposal yet, but I want to write another book similar to the book that I'm talking about. I think it'll be called something like Environmentalism Without Prejudice. It's going to be in part about wild animal suffering, but I think it'll be broader than that. It'll be about a variety of issues at the intersection of environmental ethics and animal ethics, with an emphasis on trying to develop a conception of environmentalism that takes animals' interests as individuals seriously.
How can people find out more about your work?
Yeah, so if you just Google my name, stuff will pop up. But two main places to look, I guess, are on my academia.edu page and my Phil People page.
Well, thanks so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I appreciate it.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at @aveganphilosopher. Also, don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes or wherever else you found us. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.